Welcome to Sharpe Insights, conversations with your plan giving experts, a podcast for development professionals. Whether you're new to the field or looking to enhance your existing program, we will provide practical tips, expert advice, and real-world stories to deepen your understanding of plan giving. If you're committed to securing long-term support for your nonprofit, you've come to the right place.
Welcome to Sharpe Insights, conversations with your plan giving experts. I'm your host, Grant Miller. Today we're lucky to be joined by Eileen Heisman. Eileen is a governance-focused nonprofit executive and board leader whose 30-year tenure at National Philanthropic Trust established her as one of the most enduring authorities in American philanthropy. Recruited to the organization in 1996 as vice president and named president and CEO in 1998, Eileen directed NPT's growth from a startup public charity into the largest independent sponsor of donor-advised funds in the United States, placing her at the center of relationships with the financial institutions, family offices, and advisors that shape charitable giving nationally. Throughout her career, Eileen has become a trusted authority on charitable giving, frequently appearing in national media, including CNN and Bloomberg, and lending her expertise to publications such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and now, Sharpe Insights. Eileen, welcome to the podcast. We're so glad to have you with us today.
Thanks, Grant. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, for our listeners, let's just start at the beginning. During a fireside conversation at the CGP conference recently, you reflected on your career. And can you just share with our audience what led you into the field of plan giving?
Yes, it was somewhat of an accident. I had worked in politics and then became a political fundraiser. And I then became a mother, and I thought I needed to get a job that wasn't so seasonal and demanding. And I laughed looking back because I got another job that was seasonal and demanding. But I started to look for charitable giving fundraising jobs. And I didn't know anything about charitable giving. I knew a lot about political fundraising. And so I started doing informational interviews, and I had a couple of job offers, but one came up that interested me a great deal, and that was the first development officer at the Philadelphia Foundation, which is the community foundation in southeastern Pennsylvania. And I think I went through 7 or 8 interviews, and I did get that job. And when I started the job, the field was really largely driven by bequests. And I knew what a bequest was, but I didn't know much about it. But I went around to a lot of opinion leaders in the community foundation world, and they said, you have to get really good at plan giving. And so I started to go to seminars, and I was kind of bored because I thought I have to cultivate these gifts and wait for people to die. Like, that sounds pretty boring, especially compared to political fundraising. And then we got a single check in the mail for $650,000 from a realized bequest. And I went one day to think, I've got to get out of here, to, I wonder how this check came to us. And I went home thinking about it, and I came back the next day. Literally 1 minute, I went from, I want to leave this job, to, I want to learn how to do this work. And I started to do research on how bequests worked, especially into community foundations. And I ended up doing a deep dive in how fast community foundations were growing and how they weren't just depending on bequests. But I did learn exactly how that check came to us. I talked to the bank, talked to the trust officer, because I just needed to know the genesis of it. Because I thought, if I'm going to help make this happen, then I really have to understand the path it took to get here. And that's how I started. And Alicia Phillip, who was then the head of the Atlantic Community Foundation, became a mentor and friend. And she said to me, I'll never forget this, she said she didn't start to understand plan giving until she took 7 plan giving seminars. She said, so don't feel badly in your first one if you don't understand what they're talking about. And that was some of the best advice, because it wasn't a body of knowledge that's intuitive, and you really have to, it's technical, and you really have to study it and understand it. And it's part technical and part psychology and part marketing. And so I just decided that I was going to take that advice, and just with the information I had with tracking this gift and my interest in the community foundation world and this thirst for plan giving knowledge, that I was going to learn it and learn it well. And from my career, I guess it appears that I have.
Absolutely. Wow, 7 rounds of interviews, huh?
Yes.
I think I've been there before. It's not fun for anybody.
Not fun. And you keep on thinking you're going to be rejected in the next one, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, they're lucky that you stuck through all 7 rounds of the interviews, and also that you were able to see the results of this work so early on and have that change your mind about the work and your trajectory. I think a lot of development officers don't really get to see the fruits of their labor often. So that's great, and great for that organization. Well, you mentioned that you received some great advice, but looking back over the nearly 3 decades you've been doing this, what are a few moments besides the one that you just mentioned that stand out as the most pivotal in your career?
I had a lot of good mentors. Another one of my mentors was Peter Hero, who ran the Silicon Valley Community Foundation for a number of years, who's deceased now. And Peter, when I came into NPT, came in as really the chief development officer. That wasn't my title, but it's essentially what I was. And then got promoted to the CEO. Peter said to me, just remember this. I remember it so well. He said, everything that happens below the waterline in the community foundation or the donor advised fund world is as important as everything that happens above the waterline, meaning all the PR, marketing, positioning, logo, all those things above the waterline, donor relationships. Those are all the things you can see. And he said, you need to pay attention to all the operations, all the finance, investment management, oversight, the ability to keep track of things. And he said, those things are so important. He goes, I made the mistake at one point in my career running Silicon Valley of not paying enough attention to them. And it really came back to haunt me. So you're early in this, and NPT is just starting. So pay attention as much to below the waterline, all the back office functions, as you do above. And that was unbelievably good advice, because when you're growing a charity from scratch and trying to scale it, and of course I didn't know the path it was going to take, I never forgot that advice. I actually took it and I got to like it. I mean, if you would have told me I was going to like risk management, I would have said, what? But I actually liked risk management. I liked operations. So I loved the fundraising part. I loved the plan giving part, but I also liked the part that allowed the trains to run on time.
Well, I think one of my wife has worked as a development officer for many years, and at a lot of organizations, she can get burnout pretty quickly on dealing with everything from the politics to the board to the leadership to the donors to all of the ins and outs and the nuances of dealing with these organizations. And I think that that's not necessarily just unique to her experience. You've been doing this for nearly 3 decades, and you seem to be really still very passionate about this profession and this work. What keeps you so excited about this work?
I wanted to make the world a better place always from a very young age. So I always loved that. And I tried out early in my career doing direct service, like being at the front lines of a charitable entity. And I realized it just wasn't my kind of work. I still wanted to make the world a better place, but I didn't want to be providing direct service. And so when I realized that I could be an ambassador for the mission, and I could talk to people of wealth and influencers, we didn't use that term at the time, and explain how mission activities were going on in the organization and be passionate about that, and that I could get paid to do that. And then in addition to that, I could help move capital, financial capital, into the social sector. I just thought that I had gotten so lucky. Like, I felt like it was a great match for a lot of things I was interested in. And I always had interested in the business world. So it wasn't like I was disdaining business. And so I was able to integrate a lot of things that I really enjoyed doing. And in particular, plan giving, because no two plan gifts are exactly the same. I loved the fact that you weren't duplicating something and just doing the same thing over and over again. And so I always had this tagline underneath me that I never wrote out, but people who know me know I say this, the weirder, the better. I mean, I loved all the unusual things that came our way. I love those unexpected phone calls, and I loved the uniqueness of the plan giving kind of landscape. And it didn't matter if I've done 10 plan gifts in the last few months, 2 or 3 would come, and it was starting from scratch on a learning curve. So I got excited about that. And so to put all that together and work in mission-driven organization, like, I thought, how lucky can I get? And then NPT was a startup, but it was brand new when I got there. It wasn't even launched yet. So I got to see something from its inception, and we didn't know it was going to work at the beginning. So I was just thinking, I always had a plan B and a plan C. I thought, well, if this doesn't work, I could go work at a university and plan giving. Like, I always had things in my head I could kind of lean back on if it didn't work, but it ended up being an enormous success.
Yeah, it sounds like it connected all the dots of your interests, maybe even some you didn't know that you had at the time.
Exactly.
That's great. Yeah, I remember when I got hired here with Sharpe Group, Cindy Hatler told me every day is different. And it's very true, and something I really appreciate about this work. I can see where some folks might find that a little bit frustrating, but I do like all of the things that you didn't even anticipate that pop up sometimes.
That's true. And if you layer over that legislative and regulatory changes, that even if you get a lot of things figured out and there's new regulations, you have to retool yourself in how, retirement accounts work. I mean, minimum qualified distribution, none of those things existed when I started, right? Because retirement plans weren't the way they are. Those things, and then a lot of illiquid assets that were tangible personal property or interest in private businesses. I mean, I started out pretty plain vanilla, and as NPT morphed and my knowledge grew, it was just amazing what I had to learn and what I enjoyed learning. And we ended up having a legal team working on this at NPT, but I used to literally, and my general counsel, he could have had like a carpet wear out between my office and his office. He had a big white board and all the illiquid gift assets were on his board and handwritten, with the lines like a chart he had just made himself. And I would say to him, run me through the gifts, because the planned gifts were just the things that I loved hearing about the most. And he did. He used to run me through, and I'd say any risks. I'd ask him, what was any problems you think? What portion is? He said most of the things that are up there are probably going to close. Going to happen. But I just loved hearing the intricacies of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you like being adaptable, this is definitely the right field to work in. So let's get into some of the details here. When you started National Philanthropic Trust, donor advised funds were a relatively small part of the philanthropic landscape, as I understand it. What did you see then that others may not have? What need did you see there that you wanted to help?
It morphed over time, but I had worked with donor advised funds since 1987, which is kind of puts me in a great grandmother DAF mode. And they were really complicated. They had trust forms, like they read like a trust document, used to give people a paper version. They had to give it to their lawyer. Their lawyer had to key it in. They were hard to open accounts. It was very hard to understand exactly what it was. And I started out by trying what is this thing? And then one of my goals was to make it easy as possible for a donor to give, right? I mean, that's a basic concept of not just plain giving, but any giving. So I actually took this form and made it a fill in the blank form, even though it was still 10 pages. So they didn't have to have the lawyer rekey it. And the lawyer then couldn't negotiate a lot of terms and conditions. So they would say I, and then a big blank area for somebody's name. And so that was one of the early adaptations. And I took it to the other community foundations. And I said, look, there's donor advised funds. We can have a form that they can just fill out. The donors can self-fill it out instead of, handing a typewritten Xerox copy of a trust agreement, what looked like a trust agreement, to their lawyer. And, whenever a lawyer gets an agreement like that, they can't help but edit it, right? And you just can't have them moving around language around the DAF because it was, regulated. So I knew that making it easier was really important. And I knew that they had the ability to, people were talking about instead of a private foundation, but that language didn't even really exist yet. It was this idea that donors could have a structure and they could be a part of the community foundation. I mean, the real reason that I got involved with them, it was a way to get living donors involved with giving at a community foundation. And that to me made all the sense in the world. And because if they're doing their own private foundation, they're detached from you. But if they do a donor advised fund, they're a part of you. And I just thought that made a lot of sense. And so you can be closer to them. You can know them more. They're part of your community. And I liked that idea. I actually love the community foundation world a lot. There was tension often between the national donor advised funds and the community foundations. And I used to go out of my way to try to undo that because I had such a high regard for the community foundation world. So I saw that it was a part of a way donors could have the tool. It's not a private foundation. They can be part of this world. We can take illiquid assets. We can be way beyond bequests. There are things we can do. And in order to launch the program at the Philadelphia Foundation, after I had that $650,000 check moment, I thought, well, how am I going to grow this program? I need to learn more about how community foundations grow their assets. So I asked a couple of people I knew in the community foundation world, what are the 10 fast growing community foundations? Can you give me their names? And this is before email, right? This is in the late 80s. So I got all their names and phone numbers, and I got my yellow pad out, and I got my 15 questions out. And one by one, over several months, I interviewed either the chief development officer or the CEO of each of these fast growing community foundations and said, said, what did you do to have the success you've had? And I made tons of notes. And at the end of those 10 interviews, I assembled all my notes and put together a plan based on what they said had worked in all the different regions and cities where they lived around the country. And it was that plan that I used for the Philadelphia Foundation. And a lot of what they were talking to me about was using donor advised funds as a way to engage donors. And so it was part of this thing that was organically starting. And the only two entities that were offering DAFs at the time were community foundations and Jewish federations. And so it was really limited to that world. And I'm a Jewish person, but I wasn't part of the Jewish philanthropy world at all because my parents didn't have that kind of money and they weren't that involved in that. But I understood that there were only these two entities that were offering them. And so I took my plan, and then those 10 people that I talked to became mentors and friends and people that I knew. And we sort of evolved the industry together. And then after about 5 years at the Philadelphia Foundation, I stopped. I didn't want to work there anymore for a lot of different reasons, some of which your wife, you mentioned the board was complicated. There's a lot of politics. And I just felt like I wasn't able to be my full self there all the time. So I went and worked in hospital philanthropy as the director of planned giving in 2 hospitals. And by that time, I had really gotten good. I had gone to my 7+. I probably had gone to 15 or 20 planned giving seminars by then and multiple national conferences at the National Committee of Planned Giving, which was its name at the time. And so I just was putting together this whole body of knowledge. And then when I heard NPT was being started and they wanted to start a National Donor Advised Fund program, I had just done all this national research, and I had just done, it was 5 years later, but it wasn't that long. I took that research that I had done in my community foundation job, and I said, I'm going to take this same body of knowledge that I was going to did use to grow the Philadelphia Foundation, and I'm going to use it to grow NPT. And by that time, of course, we had email and we had the beginning of fintech, of financial technology. And then we had Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund, which was what it was called at the time, had launched. And they were doing a lot of very large marketing. And so I could take advantage of the tails of their marketing. Vanguard launched after us, and then Schwab after that. The National Christian Foundation, I can't remember when it came in, and Morgan Stanley. So, the players were just developing. It was the 90s. And when technology came in, it really started to change things. And then one of the biggest influences in the change is those old trust documents that look like trust documents that open DAF accounts. And they didn't call them accounts at the time. That was considered too commercial of a word. But the mutual fund companies who had started their own charities, they took the mutual fund account opening form and morphed it into a DAF account opening form. And that, between that and the technology, it went from something that was hard to do, hard to understand, that you could do, you download this form, fill it out, fax it. People were faxing then. And you could open it very quickly. And so while the idea had been percolating, it was the involvement really of the for-profit world. And, and they have more access to capital than charities ever do. It was their investment in wanting to grow this asset that actually brought around a lot of the changes. And so it was like taking these, they weren't baby steps, they was like intermediate steps, but they were done incrementally. So it wasn't like I had this big vision. And as we grew, and as people started asking us, can you use it for this? Can you use it for that? I realized how flexible they were. So the flexibility of DAFs came as a result of being in the marketplace and having your constituency, your donors ask you, can I use it for this? Or their lawyers, I can use it for that. And so this idea of being flexible and curious, which I was just talking about, was all part of seeing all of a sudden, there's a flexible tool, easy to open up, useful to people who want to be philanthropic. And then, of course, technology took it to a whole nother level when you can actually open it up on the account online. And it lags, the charitable sector lags in its applying how it applies technology to its work. I think we're 5 years behind the for-profit sector, but all the fintech advancements eventually cascaded into the donor advised fund world. And so you had to be ready for them. The biggest enemy you could have would be yourself saying, but this is the way I always did it. Because the change that was happening, you had to adapt to it. I happen to like that. I think some people didn't like. The other thing that I really liked watching is that financial advisors who otherwise were just selling for-profit products, your stocks and bonds, and private equity didn't exist anymore then yet. But there was a way in which the donor advised fund, the technology could be created, the ability to scale. But then you had financial advisors who all of a sudden wanted to talk about DAFs to their clients. Like, that was radical. I remember when early on in the 90s, that we went to a bunch of state attorney generals to see if whether they should be registered as fundraisers. Should financial advisors who were talking about DAFs be registered as fundraisers in all the states that this activity was taking place, which by then was probably every state in the union. And we always were interested in being compliant. And we hired a lawyer to help us knock on these doors of the state attorney generals. And they said no, they didn't believe it constituted fundraising, like the way that their regulations were intended. And that really, the fact that they said no, they didn't have to register, made it possible for financial advisors to actually help distribute them, right? And so when you think of development officers as one development officer touching 20, 50 people, 80 people a year, maybe a couple hundred if they're really lucky, and then all of a sudden financial advisors are talking about it, it really took the numbers of people that were talking about DAFs by a multiple of, I can't even put a multiple on that, of all of a sudden they were getting talked about by very different kinds of professionals. That between that and the technology, the industry, the DAF industry just expanded. And there's some wisdom that says that even with all of the growth that we've had, that we're still just in the early double digits of penetrating the kind of all the clients that could be talked to about DAFs being part of their world. And if the charitable sector alone could not have touched all those people because we didn't have enough capital to hire enough people to do that work, right? And so at the beginning of NPT, I was knocking on doors one at a time, and I would try to talk to 10 lawyers at a time if I could make that happen. When we started private labeling DAFs with large financial institutions, I was teaching bankers and advisors how to talk to their clients about donor advised funds. And so if I could talk to 20 or 30 of them, and they each had a book of clients of 100, this notion of allowing them to be educated in how a DAF works, that was just a monstrous change. So I lived through all those changes. I tried to be an amplifier of the best practices always. I was excited about the amount of capital coming into the social sector, and the plan giving aspect of it always interested me. So I didn't really know what I was stepping into when I was stepping into it. I thought I was coming to like a national community foundation, and these doors would open. It was like that check came in, and I would go, oh, so these things would happen. Technology would happen, these forms, and then the financial service companies, and then this private label idea. And all of a sudden I would have these stop moments. Oh, wow, this is another door opening. And I was happy to walk through it. I walked through it with excitement, but also caution, but a lot of fire in my belly about making the world better. And if we can move more funds into this sector, that's great. So I was really interested. I never had worked in the financial services world ever. I've never worked in the financial services world. Actually, when I retired, I technically retired in 2024. I thought, wow, if we had raised $63 billion by then. I thought if I had been in the private sector, I probably would be leaving with a lot of equity. But instead, I was leaving with my 401k and my 457B. With the power of compounding, it was fine. But it was, I thought, boy, in the financial sector, if you were able to attract those kinds of dollars, you would have been rewarded in a different way. But you know what? My emotional reward of what I did was always with me, always.
Yes, that's often priceless. So you've been integral to this process of the increasing popularity of donor advised funds. And, you mentioned going back through this, you've did a lot of adapting and changing, and you mentioned a lot of doors opening. You didn't mention a lot of conflict or resistance too much there. Was there any of that there? And if you could go back in time, was there anything that you would have done differently during this process?
There was some tension with the national DAFs and the community foundation donor advised funds. I really tried to open that door a number of times, and I tried to work through the council on foundations, and they wouldn't let me be a member of the NPT, be a member of the council. Finally, they did. But that was sad for me. I felt like we were in the same business, doing great work, and it wasn't a shared vision. I think it was more looked at as a zero-sum game. Like if you're raising this money and you weren't there, this money would be with us. And I'm not sure that's true, but I think that was a belief at the time. And I don't know, maybe still. I thought that there was a lot of suspicion about the National Donor Advised Fund sponsors sort of not paying attention to the rules or just being financially motivated. I know those folks really well, personally and professionally. And nobody was trying to live close to the edge. They were really good citizens for the sector, very compliant. So I think there was some accusations about that weren't true, that people were trying to disincentivize donors to give so they could make more money on the assets under management. I never saw that happen. And I talked to them, my colleagues a lot. And then, DAPs were giving out 20%, and which didn't include overhead, and private foundations give out 5%, which does include overhead. And so, but somehow we got to be the object of great criticism by a few critics. And a lot of those criticisms were led by a woman named Ray Madoff and Roger Collinfax. There's a handful of people that have really been DAF critics. And that was heartbreaking to me, because we were, our payout was so much higher. The amount of assets we had were much smaller. We have 20% of what private foundations have. So they have 5 times the amount of assets and they're giving out 5%. We have 20% of the assets, and we're giving, 1/5 of what they have, and we're giving out 20%, not including overhead. And so somehow DAFs got to be the object of a lot of dislike from categories of people in the sector. I know that the 990 issue got people mad because they didn't know which donors were giving grants out. So our 990s and the national DAPs or community foundation DAPs just list all the grants. They don't say from which DAF they came. And so I know there was an effort in the last 10 years, including National Philanthropic Trust, to put donors, if the donors agreed to it, most donors did, to have their donors' names on the grant checks so that charities know exactly who was giving them the money. But I did my best to talk about the advantages, but some of those critics were loud and persistent, and it was impossible to go head to head with them every minute when something happened like that. And I lived with that. And did it keep me up at night? Yes, it did. I did this to make the world a better place and to have a handful of people really take issue with it. And it really caught on. I mean, there's still critics. I read it now and I'm not in that sector anymore, but I look back and I still have a visceral reaction to it. But Dan Heist, who now took over the National Donor Advised Fund study that NPT managed and did, we launched for a number of years. I guess we had it for about 17 years. He's doing a lot of work around trying to have a lot of transparency around the data for how fast the money goes out, how long it stays in there, that I hope dispels some of the critics. I'm not sure it has, but I think it's helped. And the other thing it's been fun to see, which isn't really a tension, is that charities are now putting in their fundraising materials how to work with donors that have donor advised funds and to include DAF-friendly language. And you can make a recommendation to us for your donor advised fund. And so that's been a whole part of the industry that has grown up even more and started to mature. Not even mature, I think it's still in its infancy just a few years ago.
Maybe one more question about donor advised funds. We'll move on to something else after. Yep. But as you mentioned, one of the reasons that donor advised funds are becoming so increasingly popular is, amongst donors and organizations, despite what the critics might say, is that it does allow living donors to make an impact on these organizations now. And for the organizations, it helps them to continue building relationships, which I mentioned this in a recent podcast, but most of the issues that come up, I think, with nonprofits and their plan giving programs kind of boils down to relationships. But also donor advised funds are very flexible and they're very easy to establish and to use to donate to organizations. For, say, organizations or plan giving officers who you recently said are kind of stuck in their ways or have been doing things a certain way for a really long time and maybe are kind of missing the boat on donor advised funds, is there anything that you think that people misunderstand about donor advised funds?
I don't think they realize how flexible they really are. You can make a multi-year grant recommendation out of a DAF. So if you're interested in supporting a capital campaign, you don't have to write the check every year. If you have a big capital event in your life, you're selling a house, you're getting a bonus, you inherited money, something happened, maybe at retirement time, you can put money in a DAF and have 5 years of giving, take advantage of a better tax deduction that single year. And then you can spread it over 5 additional years if you need to. But so it's great for that. I think it was amazing. People, smaller charities who did not have planned giving departments would call us. And I know we weren't the only, NPT was not the only one, would call us and say, we have a donor that wants to give us land or real estate or some kind of tangible personal property. We don't have the talent, technique, and risk, a profile to take it. And we happily would kind of act as their planned giving arm. We did the due diligence on the gift before we accepted it. And then if we were able to take it, they would either put it in a donor advised fund or what's called a designated fund. And we would accept it on behalf of smaller charities and sometimes even big ones, big universities. They just didn't feel comfortable with the transaction for some reason. And then we would charge a small the costs, or out-of-pocket costs and some of the costs of our time to do that. And then it would get granted out to the charity that knocked on our door. So they still had the relationship with the donor, but we had translated this illiquid asset into liquidity for them. And so when you have donors that are interested in helping the world, and you can be sort of a repository to help smaller entities get to their goals. I don't know, having a block of appreciated stock, whether it's a single stock or multiple stocks. And if you went to 10 small charities and said to them, I want to give you $4,000 of my appreciated stock, a lot of them don't even have brokerage accounts. A lot of them don't even know what it means to, how do I receipt that? How do I even calculate the receipt? What do I do with it? So if you don't have a brokerage account, then you can't accept it and therefore you can't sell it, but then you don't even understand how the process works. If you think of a DAF as being able to take $100,000, $50,000 of that single stock or multiple stocks, we know how to, all the DAF providers I know how to receipt it, accept it, sell it after it's gifted, and then have the donor make grant recommendations from those to all those small charities. All those small charities were just relieved of having to understand and know that. And a lot of donors would say, well, you can't do it. Okay, I'll find somebody else. But a DAF provider can allow the donor to gift. Probably one of the best assets to gift was a publicly traded stock that they've held for more than a year, and to do it with a lot of ease. And make their grant recommendations online really quickly. And then they save them in your account. So if you want to give to that charity over and over again, you don't have to re-enter their tax ID number. It's there inside attached to your DAF account. So all of those things made it really easy for donors to give. And all of them were able to unlock illiquid assets and turn them into social capital. And to me, that was so exciting. Like a partial interest in a business, how could that be turned into a charitable gift? But we had people who would give us a partial interest in a business. Sometimes partnerships, if you were allowed to take the kind that they were offering. And so all of a sudden we were looking at assets that weren't even considered giftable. And so that was fun for me to think about opening the door that those assets were then going to be granted out. And according to Dan Heiss' study, there's a fair number of DAFs that are actually fully liquidated within about 8 years. And so it's not like, I know there's a lot of people that think that DAFs are hoarding money. They're actually churning money out way faster than private foundations. And I know that I think Fidelity and or Vanguard have both done studies that DAF donors tend to give more frequently. And they tend to give unrestricted as well. So I feel like we're a real friend to the sector. And that idea of unlocking illiquid assets to me is a real benefit that a lot of charities don't want to be bothered with even learning about.
Wow. So it sounds like our listeners need to amp up their writing about donor advised funds for their donors. It sounds like a simple and incredibly easy way. Yeah.
Making friends with a DAF provider. So if you do get a gift asset offered to you that you think you would like, but you don't know how to take it, they can be a colleague and a partner in accepting that asset. And there's a lot of charitable entities that know that, but I bet for everybody that knows it, there's probably 10 or 15 other planned giving officers that don't know it, or major gift officers for sure.
I bet you're right. So you also mentioned other ways that donors can support organizations in the short term rather than the long term. And you've written and spoken about helping donors make more intentional gifts rather than just really large gifts. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think that was a comment. I've made this before. I mean, people often ask me what advice do you have for donors for grant making? And I always suggest to make fewer larger gifts and to stay with the charity's over several years, that no social problems get solved in 1 or 2 years, and don't change your giving year to year. Don't just like refresh and do all new entities. The other thing I say is like, how much time do you spend researching a restaurant when you want to go out to eat? 20 minutes, half an hour? I mean, sometimes it can take a while. But you should at least spend that time or double that looking at charitable causes and then charities that are addressing those causes, at least the amount of time you spend looking for a restaurant. And that's kind of a smug, and I don't mean to be smug when I say that, but there's the tried and true entities that you know about and like, but then there's always new things coming up, or there's a problem you might see in the media. And if you want to figure out, wow, how can I make a dent in that? To spend some time doing research. And then if you're drawn to disaster relief or some kind of illness that somebody in your family has had, try to figure out where the best research is or the best kind of provider is. And then don't do it for a year and then walk away. One of the things about most charitable long-term missions is that there's hardly anything. It's not like a quarterly report from a for-profit where you get a quarterly returns. And a lot of things take years to figure out. Reducing teenage pregnancy, stopping people from smoking, literacy issues. Those are things that don't get fixed in a year. Sometimes there's generational issues, that we live with human beings, right, in our society who are not everybody's blessed and wealthy. And so people living in all different circumstances, and helping them is not a one-time quick fix often. So if you really care about something, to stay with it for a while. And when they go back to the charity and kind of commensurate with what your size of your gift is, and then ask them how they're doing. Some charities do great report cards, some don't do them as well. But, to keep in touch with them. My graduate degree major was social program evaluation, which is a really difficult thing, which is how do you evaluate the impact of social programs? And it's really expensive and really difficult, and it's often considered overhead, which is kind of demonized by donors at times. But, not everybody does great program evaluation, but you can often get a good feel for, even without data. With data is great, but if they don't have data, by talking to them, visiting them, and having a sense of what they're doing close up, you can often get a really good feel for what's going on.
Well, thank you. Well, wrapping us up here, and this is funny because I always write looking ahead 10 years, but with the way that technology emerges almost exponentially these days, and every time I turn around, I was thinking about this yesterday, I'm like, wow, every time I turn around, something happens technologically that comes out, and I'm like, oh, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. And then 3 weeks later, I'm in the back of a Waymo driverless car, bringing my kid home from the baseball game.
Have you done that?
Because I'm like, oh yeah, I don't want to talk to a driver.
I've never been in a driverless car yet, but it's probably.
We really just wanted to try it at least once, but I think I do prefer to support the Lyft and Uber drivers myself. But we were like, we got to check this out at least once. And it was weird. And anyway, but I always say looking ahead 10 years, but let's say looking ahead 5 years. What are some trends that you think are going to have the greatest impact on planned giving and philanthropy? Anything we should be especially excited or concerned about? And then I guess this is a 2, maybe 3-part question, but what are you most optimistic about in the future of planned giving?
I think people's generosity is never going to go away. And I think empathy and a wish to improve the conditions, whether that's the environment or people or nature, or is always going to be true, or this research in science, technology. So I really believe that humanity wants to improve itself at its core. And I think people are basically good. And I think communities that we build in our country are built around mutual assistance. And it's a powerful genesis of our country. And I've thought about it. I'm from Philadelphia. So our whole birthday of our country has been very close to my heart. But when you look at what Benjamin Franklin did. I just heard a talk about this yesterday in the Johnson Center on Philanthropy in Michigan. They did a great about the history of philanthropy in the U.S. It was all about Philadelphia. I'm talking about Benjamin Franklin created communities where people of wealth were not required for the community to thrive and exist. And that was pretty radical at the time. So I believe that human condition is not going to change. About 15 years ago or 20, somebody asked me how the internet was going to affect charitable giving. And I said, we're at the tip of the iceberg. I said, I have no idea, but I'm sure it's going to have a radical effect. AI is going to have a big effect on how people do their jobs in charitable giving. It's going to have a probably radical effect about how we can track donors and understand donor motivations. But we're at the tip of the iceberg in that. and, kind of unimaginable. I wasn't necessarily the person that did the invention, but when I saw it, like when somebody identified we can private label donor advised funds for large financial firms, I said, that's a great idea. So I'm really good at identifying when it's a good idea. I don't necessarily create the idea, but I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see the use of technology and AI in the business in ways that we didn't expect. I think plan giving is also going to depend on the economy thriving, right? Because people need to own assets. Unfortunately, we're seeing a collection of assets in fewer wealthier people and not as broadly held. So I hope that trend shifts away from that. I think we'd have to change some tax laws for that to happen. But I don't think charitable giving is going to go away. I don't think the United States is going to dip in its wish to give back. I think the trend of it being concentrated is probably going to continue. So I think it's going to be a lot of work for fundraisers and technology and giving circles. And Giving Tuesday, there's a few things out there that could really make the swirl of annual giving kind of work better. But I think that not work better, but keep average people, middle-class people involved in giving. I think that's really, really important to me. It's an extension of democracy. And so I think that we're going to hopefully use the technology we have to, keep that group of people that have shrunk away from annual giving, according to Giving USA, to get them back involved. And every generation thinks the generation behind them, the younger people don't know, and they're not as involved. And the greatest generation thought us baby boomers were a bunch of ne'er-do-wells. So all this stuff about Gen X and Gen Y, I think they're going to step up to the table in all different ways. I just think they're going to be as generous or perhaps even more. I don't know, but I don't think we have lost our interest in generosity. And it's been exciting to watch all the research on all the generations looking at I think there's promise everywhere. So I think humanity's going to be around. I hope I have another 25 years to watch it. And I count my blessings all the time that I was able to work in an industry that had innovation and giving back and kind of a thankfulness about it, a generosity, the graciousness of generosity was never lost on me for a minute, like literally not a minute. I loved going to work and thinking that's what I did every day.
I love that. So you sound pretty optimistic about the future. And I love that
I was born optimistic.
I like that. Yeah, I could take a page out of your book there for sure. And I do believe there's a lot of hand-wringing and catastrophizing and overgeneralization about pretty much everything. But in this context, especially the generational aspect. And I think you put it so eloquently that it is a generational thing to kind of belittle the following generation. And so let's all catch ourselves when we're making
it's
fun
our
of...
job to mentor them, right? It's our job to instill values and to be enthusiastic. I've been teaching philanthropy and fundraising at Penn for 20 years now. And I'm now teaching in a more advanced course that's more on the grant-making side with Kat Rosqueta, runs the Center for Impact Philanthropy there. But I've been watching the young people who want to support the sector go through this master's program in nonprofit leadership, and I see their talent and passion and commitment firsthand. It's not over there. It's like right in front of me. And so I think that has really given me really concrete evidence that we're in good hands.
I love it. Speaking of good hands, Eileen, we're so privileged to have you on the show and to share your many years of experience and expertise in this world. And I hope you continue to keep writing about positive things you see, especially with technology. Seems like you were pretty on point up to this point. So I hope that you'll just keep offering your experience and expertise there. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, share it with a colleague, and join us next time for another conversation on the ideas, people, and strategies shaping the future of charitable gift planning. And to all of our listeners, thank you for being a part of this conversation. Until next time, I'm Grant Miller. Thanks for listening. We hope today's discussion gave you practical takeaways to grow your plan giving program. To submit questions and topics for future episodes, go to sharpegroup.org or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. Until then, stay sharp.